Interesting. Welcome everyone to this Ashford's webinar talking about the infrastructure levy, community infrastructure levy, and giving you an update. My name is David Richardson. If you don't know me, I'm a partner, head of planning at Ashford's. I'm joined by James from our Bristol office, who's an associate in the team as well. Before we get into the meat of the webinar, so to speak, can I just remind you to mute your computers and turn off your videos. To be honest, James and I can't see you anyway. Rather disconcertingly, we're just looking at a screen which has our slides on it. Chat is, I understand, open, so if you have questions, by all means, put them in the chat group. To be honest, we're going to be quite tight for time, so if we can't get to them in this seminar, then we know most of you, so we'll probably get back to you over the email. And also, I've had a couple of questions in advance, so we'll try and deal with those first. So, what we're going to cover today. So James, who I'll seamlessly hand over to in a moment, is going to give you a recap just to warm you up and remind you about how SIL works now, or at least what are the fundamental principles of SIL. He's then going to talk to you about some quite granular changes that have been brought into effect by amendment regulations to deal with COVID, and those are aimed largely at giving SIL some more flex and helping out SMEs. And then once you've been through that quite granular level of detail, we're going to sit back and spend 10-15 minutes thinking about the white paper just to ease you to the end of the day. That will be me talking to you about some of the big ideas in that paper and what they might mean going forward. So that's our mission. James, if I could hand over to you.
Yeah.
We'll just allow you control.
Slides. Hi, everybody. So yeah, just to begin, I will just give a bit of a recap over the history of SIL to date, and slides have disappeared from me. Are people having trouble seeing the slides? It's back now. So yeah, a bit of a history to date and just some of the fundamental principles of SIL, which will hopefully help provide a bit of context to the changes that have recently come into play in response to the COVID pandemic. So SIL, it was originally introduced under the Planning Act 2008 and was subsequently implemented by the Community Infrastructure Levy Regulations 2010. Since then, there's been a number of fairly substantial amendments coming into play over the years. Notably last September, there was quite a substantial update to the regs to sort of deal with a number of shortcomings that had been identified by various issues over the years. So I'm just playing around with these slides a bit too much. Go back. So sorry, and then in July of this year, we've had the latest set of amendments come into play in response to COVID. So they were implemented on the 22nd of July. And that's now the 9th set of amendments to the SIL regs since their inception in 2010. So as you're probably all aware, SIL is essentially a tax on new development. It's spent by local planning authorities on infrastructure necessitated by development in their local authority areas, and local authorities will generally prepare a list of the types of infrastructure that SIL can be spent on, and then all SIL receipts that are received in respect of developments in their area will be used to fund that infrastructure. In terms of how it's calculated, it's a calculation based on new or additional floor space, which is consented under a new planning permission, and that square metre area of new floor space will be multiplied by the council's SIL rate for the particular type of development. So a few key points to note. It only applies to planning permissions granted after a council has adopted a charging schedule. So it's down for each local planning authority to introduce SIL in its area, and until they have adopted a charging schedule to collect SIL, any planning permissions granted before that time will not be liable for the SIL charge. There are a number of exemptions from liability available, so commonly social housing relief on new residential developments. Individual house builders may seek self-build relief if they're building a self-build home. There are charitable exemptions, among others. Still, it's triggered upon the commencement of development, so that's the moment that the charge crystallises and becomes payable. But when it's calculated from, that's when what's termed the time at which planning permission first permits development. Now, usually that will be when planning permission is granted, but in certain circumstances, so for phased planning permissions, for example, it might be when the pre-commencement conditions have all been discharged or the reserved matters approval have been obtained in the case of an outline permission. It's also, so depending on the particular circumstances of the local authority and whether a instalment policy has been introduced by that local authority, SIL can sometimes be payable in instalments, and I'll come on to that a bit more shortly, as that forms quite a key part of the updated guidance. So just a brief overview of the relevant forms that need to be submitted during the SIL process. So the first step will be submission of the additional information form. So that goes in generally alongside a planning application and will detail the new and existing floor space that's comprised in the development. It also includes a sort of box about any intention to seek relief or exemption from requirement to pay SIL. So once that form's gone in, the next form to go in will be the assumption of liability, and that's for the developer to essentially confirm that they will be the party responsible for payment of SIL. If no one assumes responsibility for payment of SIL, it defaults to the landowners on which the development will be carried out. Alongside the assumption of liability, any application for a relief or exemption will also need to be sought. So if it's social housing relief, that form will need to go in detailing sort of the level of social housing that would be on the site. Once all those forms have been submitted, the council can then issue a liability notice confirming the amount of SIL which will be payable in respect of the development, and that will factor in any exemptions or reliefs that have been granted. And following that, they can also issue the demand notice, which will set out the payment schedule for when each SIL payment is due. The final step in the process then is a developer needs to submit a commencement notice in advance of starting development on site. That needs to be in at least 24 hours before they enter site, and they can then commence development, at which point the SIL charge crystallises and it becomes payable in accordance with the schedule set out in the demand notice. So whether in one lump sum or by instalments, if the council does have an instalment policy in place. So over the last 6 months and since the lockdown came into play, there's obviously been a lot of delays on development sites and no development progressing. And as a result of that, some developers will have found themselves in a position where profits aren't being realised when they anticipated. Now, the SIL regulations are fairly rigid in terms of payment schedules and how interest is applied to late payments. And as a result of that, there are situations where developers may find themselves in sort of a situation where they're facing financial hardship or facing viability issues if they're having to pay SIL liability in full when originally required. Or it might be that developers are just experiencing financial issues sort of as other results of the pandemic. So in response to this, the government has introduced a further update to the regulations themselves, which came into effect on the 22nd of July. Now, the changes to the legislation are principally to protect small and medium developers. So that's developers that have an annual turnover of less than 45 million. However, alongside the changes to the legislation, they've also issued some further planning practice guidance, which is geared towards local authorities and how they should approach SIL and its enforcement during the pandemic. And that applies more broadly to all developers and all SIL liabilities. So just starting with the guidance. So the updated guidance, it sets out certain steps that charging authorities can take to help ease the burden on developers during the pandemic. And it encourages charging authorities to take a positive approach to engaging with developers to ensure that SIL liabilities do not cause undue burden over the period of disruption caused by COVID. So overall, there's sort of an overarching message that local authorities should engage proactively with developers during this time, exercise their discretion where appropriate, and particularly where a developer is facing legitimate issues with payment of SIL during this time as a result of what's going on. So breaking this down a little bit further in the particular areas it touches upon. So Regulation 69B, that allows charging authorities to implement instalment policies. So this allows a SIL charge to be spread out over several payments, which can obviously help with cash flow for developers. If a council or charging authority has not adopted an instalment policy, the default position is that the liability is payable in full within 60 days of the intended commencement date. And even if a local authority already has an instalment policy in place, they can bring in a new one at any time. So the guidance is encouraging local authorities, or reminding local authorities that they can implement a new instalment policy. So even if one is in place, it might be that charging authorities choose to implement a more flexible or more relaxed instalment policy whilst the pandemic is ongoing. Now, there are a few key points to note about this. Any instalment policy will only apply to developments which commence after that policy has come into effect. So for developers, once they've commenced development, they are stuck with the instalment policy that is in effect at that time, even if the charging authority introduces a new one after that date. The exception to that would be phased development. So for a phased development, each phase is treated as a separate chargeable development for the purpose of SIL. So for each phase, the process will have to be gone through each time. The SIL forms will have to be submitted for each phase. So even if phase 1 has been implemented already under a particular instalment policy, it might be that a developer could benefit from a more flexible instalment policy for later phases if the council does adopt a more flexible policy going forward. So the next point that the guidance touches upon is enforcement. So collecting authorities do have discretion around how they deal with late payment of SIL, and these discretions do give some scope to help ease financial pressures on developers. So one of the enforcement powers that charging authorities have is the ability to issue a stop notice if SIL payments are not made on time. So that a stop notice would require a developer to stop any further works on site until the outstanding liability has been paid, and contravention of a stop notice would be a criminal offence. So this is a discretionary power of the authority, and one that particularly during this time should be used carefully. Similarly, local authorities also have the power to impose surcharges on a person or business that hasn't paid SIL by the due date. Again, these surcharges are discretionary. So what the guidance is getting at really is that local authorities should think carefully before using these enforcement powers, and where there are legitimate reasons why a developer is struggling to pay, that they should perhaps exercise their discretion not to use powers to cause further hardship. The guidance also refers to Section 106 agreements and obligations or contributions that may be triggered during this time. So generally speaking, there's quite a lot more flexibility with Section 106 obligations because they're not governed by the same stringent regulations that the SIL process is. So if an obligation has been triggered and a developer is struggling to meet the timeframes for whether it be payment of a contribution or delivery of a particular obligation, then local authorities should be taking a pragmatic and proportionate approach to enforcement. And if the developer and local authority can come to an agreement that maybe an obligation should be pushed back, then a deed of variation can be used to secure that change. So now just moving on to the changes to the regulations themselves. So as I've said, these came into play on the 22nd of July 2020. They apply to England only, and the changes to the regulations are to provide additional protections for small and medium developers only. So that's developers that have an annual turnover of less than 45 million. So the key changes are a developer, or a small and medium developer at least, can request deferral of a SIL payment that's falling due within a certain time frame in particular circumstances. And where that deferral request is accepted, charging authorities also have discretion to disapply any late payment interest that's been incurred. I've also just mentioned again the surcharges here, which I've already touched upon, but will come on to again in a bit more detail. So starting with the deferral provisions. So small and medium developers can apply to a charging authority to defer a SIL payment that's due if they're experiencing financial difficulties as a result of COVID and they're having difficulty paying an amount of SIL due, which is due within what's called the material period. And I'll come on to what the material period is in a moment. If the charging authority accepts the deferral request, then they can extend the deadline for payment of the particular SIL payment by up to 6 months from the date that the deferral request is made. So the material period runs from the 22nd of July 2010 to the 31st of July 2021. Sorry, I think I said 2010, I meant 2020. So any SIL payment that falls due between these two dates, a deferral request can be made. Now, if a SIL payment has fallen due before the 22nd of July of this year, but remains unpaid and is therefore still due between these dates, then a deferral request can also be made in respect of that payment. So it might be slightly small, but I've just taken this diagram from the guidance which sets out the sort of cycle of how this process will work. So the first step is that the charging authority will have issued a demand notice setting out the payment schedule for the relevant SIL payments. If that payment falls due within the material periods, so between the 22nd of July of this year and the 31st of July next year, or that payment has fallen due beforehand and hasn't yet been paid, then a deferral request can be made to the charging authority. If the charging authority agrees to the deferral request, then the date for that payment can be extended by up to 6 months, and a new demand notice would be issued setting out the revised payment date. If the revised payment date still falls within the material period, so if, for example, the first deferral request was made in August and a 6-month deferral was agreed, so that takes you through to early next year at some point, because that payment would still be within the material period, a subsequent further deferral request could then be made. So there's the opportunity to make several deferral requests for the same payment. So a few points to note about this. Deferral requests must be made no more than 14 days before the particular payment is due, or as soon as practicable after payment has fallen due. So it's not something that developers can request far in advance of when their sole liability is due. It does need to be when payment is imminent. To support the request, a charging authority can request any information they require from the developer. So this might be some form of supporting financial information, whether a statement from an accountant or auditor or something to that effect, just to corroborate the position or financial difficulties that have been set out in the deferral request. The developer then must provide that information within 14 days, and if that information is not provided, then the charging authority can refuse the deferral request. On the charging authority side, they must consider the deferral request as soon as possible after it's been received, and a decision must be issued no more than 40 days after the request has been made. As I said before, if the deferral request is approved and the new payment date then falls still within the material period, so still before the 31st of July 2021, then a further deferral request could then be made for that same payment. And one key thing to note is that the charging authority cannot impose any late payment interest or surcharges on a SIL payment whilst they're considering a deferral request. So if the deferral request is approved, there'll be a new payment date, which is up to 6 months after the date that the request was made, and a new demand notice will be issued. If the deferral request is refused, there's no right of appeal, and payment then must be made within 7 days of the charging authority's decision. And because, or just to recap, the request can only be made within 14 days of the payment becoming due. So factoring in the time that it will take for the charging authority to determine that application, that means that the payment will generally have become due and crystallised during that time. So that's why the payment is then payable very quickly after the refusal. So the next change to move on to is the application of late payment interest. So the situation under the regulations is where SIL payments are not made on time, late payment interest must be applied to that amount at a rate of 2.5% above the Bank of England's base rate. And this isn't a discretionary interest charge. This is something that charging authorities have to add on to SIL payments if they're not made on time. The updated regulations have amended this in certain circumstances, but only where a deferral request is approved. So where a developer has submitted a deferral request to push back their SIL payment and the charging authority agrees to that, then any late payment interest that's accrued from the beginning of lockdown, which is the 21st of March 2020, to the date that the deferral request was made, that late payment interest can then be credited against the SIL amount due under the revised demand notice. So basically, where a deferral request is successful, any late payment interest that's accrued since the beginning of lockdown can then be offset against the SIL amount payable. However, if the deferral request is refused, then no, there can't be any disapplication of late payment interest, so it will be payable as normal. So just to touch finally upon surcharges. So as I already mentioned, charging authorities currently have the discretion to apply surcharges where a SIL payment's not been made within 30 days of its due date. This is a discretionary power of charging authorities. Now, whilst the regulations don't change that position at all, the one exception is that no surcharges can be applied whilst a deferral request is being considered, but otherwise the position remains unchanged, other than the fact that charging authorities are very much encouraged to use their discretion when applying surcharges under the updated guidance. So I'll now pass back to David to discuss the white paper.
Thank you, James. So stepping in slightly granular detail of how SIL works now, let's look a bit at the white paper. I've dramatically called this "Is this the end?" question mark of SIL in section 106. And I know we have a mixed audience of LPA officers and developers, and probably both sides are thinking, God, we hope so. But I might have to disappoint you on that. In terms of timescales, though, this is looking into the future, but it is the near future, particularly when you look at what the white paper says about new style local plans and putting those in place within 30 months, start to finish, and that the government wants to do it in its term, then you can see that they're going to have to work quite hard to bring in these changes if that's what they're going to do. And if you've dialed into any webinars that included people who were on the panel that fed into the white paper, you will know that their expectation is that there's a lot of work to do to get the detail, to flesh out the bones. But let's look at the white paper then. The bit we're interested in is pillar 3, and that is entitled Planning for Infrastructure and Connected Places. And there are 3 proposals there, 19 to 22. If you're reading around this, then you wouldn't look at that in isolation, because at the same time we have the changes to the planning system, consultation issued by MHCLG, and that is the paper that talks about raising the small site exception for affordable housing in 106 to 40 to 50 units, and that, where that ends up will depend on the consultation responses, I suppose. And that also introduced this new tenure of affordable housing called First Homes, which seems to be just a discounted market product, 30%, which developers will just sell direct to market. Those will be exempt from SIL, and they will also pay into or count towards IL, which we'll come on to in a second. And then there's also this interesting paper, which is a study that they've issued about how much money is actually being raised. And the figure is just under 7 billion for the period covered. And to be honest, it's hard to know if that's a lot or not. And obviously, nominally, it's a huge figure. But then what is the value of the development over that period? But the point is, you can see there seems to be an upward trend there, which raises the question, actually, is SIL slowly starting to work and do what it was supposed to do? But let's look at why change in the first place. And these quotes are taken from all 3 of those documents that I've just highlighted. I should warn you that both sides of the divide will probably bristle at some of these comments. So top left in the green box, there's considerable variation between LPAs and how they secure development contribution. The system is inherently personal. No doubt that's reacting to comments from developers that when a planning officer changes, often that means that issues are reopened or you have to have the same arguments again. If you look down one box, planning obligations are considered to be uncertain and opaque, based in part on the developer's assessment of viability. And again, that might make you bristle, because what's wrong with that? I mean, viability, without a doubt, is painful. I don't think anyone enjoys going through a viability exercise. But it does introduce flexibility, which is something that development really needs. And there's other comments there to do with delays in the system that we've heard before. Interesting comments in the bottom right, local authorities have been slow to spend SIL on early infrastructure delivery, reflecting the factors in that quote, which It's partly fair comment, but partly not. I mean, the difficulty with SIL is it's hard to know what it has been spent on unless you really go digging into monitoring reports. And that disconnect between what's delivered on the ground and what's collected, I think if you were to ask the average person, one, they wouldn't know what SIL is, and two, they wouldn't perceive any real benefit in it. So what are they trying to get to? Well, they're trying to get to a system which is simpler, clearer and quicker to navigate, that makes it harder for developers to dodge their obligations to improve infrastructure. And again, I can feel you bristling through the screen at that implication that developers are always looking for ways out of this. But let's get to the proposals now. So proposal 19, which essentially introduces what will replace SIL, the paper calls it IL, or at least infrastructure levy. I think the lingo from what I've heard of the webinars I've dialed into is it's been called a consolidated infrastructure levy or combined infrastructure levy, possibly because we've all got used to saying SIL. So what is it? Well, it's going to be a flat rate charge, which will be a fixed proportion of development value, actual or assessed, payable on occupation. Now, I don't think the paper excludes, and it will probably come out in the detail, instalments. And indeed, it's probably facetious to pick apart the paper for lack of detail. That's not what it's for. It's a big ideas paper. But you can see that because it's a proportion of development value, a lot of the concerns so far being raised are to do with, well, developments can have the same value at the end of the process, but vastly different costs to get them there. And so what does that mean for paying IL? Paper makes a point only developments achieving over a fixed threshold will pay. So obviously lower value areas may see no or fewer payments, and higher value areas should contribute more. Bearing in mind the idea of this is to collect much more than is collected now. It will be set nationally, and I suppose there are two options here: single rate set nationally, or an area specific rate. So still set nationally, but with variable rates depending on where you are. That's to be decided, and one imagines that 99% of the consultation responses will be that it needs to reflect localities. So you can probably expect that will be an area-specific rate. Local authorities are going to be allowed to borrow against future receipts to forward fund infrastructure, also forward fund other things, but in principle that must be a good thing. You look at the success at Milton Keynes, where they had English partnerships, which is now New England, forward funding a lot of that infrastructure, and that generally is seen as a success story in terms of bringing forward development. And the paper acknowledges that this IL could sit alongside mayoral SILs and SILs, that's strategic infrastructure levies. And so we still might end up with a system that doesn't actually have just one single charge. There could be others sitting alongside it. And I just note for interest the alternative option, because it kind of mirrors what was happening with SIL. The option is that the infrastructure levy is set by local authorities, but 106 is taken away, so the ability to charge through 106 is taken away. And I think they're probably slightly dubious about that, because the incentive that was introduced around SIL, which was restricting 106 by pooling, didn't seem to particularly work. So I think a strong indication is that they will probably not go with that alternative option. So proposal 20, let's leave what it is behind for a minute and look at some more of the details. So proposal 20 is that the infrastructure levy will include the exercise of PD rights. And as others have noted, that's a strange way of saying it, because actually SIL does apply to PD rights. It's just that often the charge is nil because there's no new floor space. But I'm probably being pedantic there. But the point is that often there's no SIL liability for committed development rights. That should change with infrastructure levy, so it will capture changes of use and capture the new PD rights. And a quote that made me chuckle, that's to allow these developments to better contribute to infrastructure delivery as if they were desperate to do so. Note also that it's explicit that exemptions for self-build and custom build will be retained. There's not a lot about the other exemptions, so we don't know, frankly. I mean, affordable housing obviously will come out, as we'll see in a minute. It's dealt with a different way, but there are other bits and pieces that were introduced because they were deemed fair. So moving on to proposal 21, a lot of the meat of infrastructure levy is here, and it's to do with affordable housing. So what's the premise? Well, currently affordable housing is secured through 106, as you know. Still can't be spent on it, which is the point the white paper makes. But that was a choice. I mean, in the draft legislation at the time, the list of infrastructure included affordable housing that was taken out. So that's not something that's irreversible, and wouldn't, to me, be a reason in itself to ditch SIL. So once section 106 is removed, and we'll come back to that in a second, The infrastructure levy will be the delivery, and it's via in-kind on-site delivery. And so the way this would work is that developers would deliver it, RPs could purchase a dwelling at a discount. That discount would be an offset against the infrastructure levy. So it's going to be an offsetting process rather than what we have now, which is delivery controlled by 106. And so presumably through policy and working with RPs, LPAs can set out forms and tenure. Note that it already says that first homes which we sold by the developer would be an offset too, so you get your 30% offset. Proposal 21, going into more of the detail here, designed to be market sensitive in principle. Again, we'll see what happens once the consultation finishes. So in a downturn, the paper says that a local authority could flip the units back to market units to be sold by a developer, and that would happen in instances where the in-kind provision exceeds what the liability is for all. Or indeed, if the value secured via in-kind is more than ill, the developer could not reclaim any overpayments to protect the local authority there. And this is a quote from the paper. The government could then provide a standardised agreement to codify how to share that risk. Of course, the question is, what type of agreement? Well, that could sit in 106. Two more points to make on this. To incentivise good design, the paper says that an LPA could revert to a cash payment if no RP wants to take the units. And also, LPAs may accept land in kind within the site or next to it. Now, mentioning works in kind, so highway works or other kinds of infrastructure currently included in the civil regs as an offset, and a mention of that in the paper, so we will have to see. And then proposal 2, which is quite key actually, which is more freedom over how local authorities will spend their infrastructure levy. So in that first row, currently 25% of CIL is the neighbourhood share, so that's the kind of ring-fenced amount that gets given to a parish council or a neighbourhood forum. And they are actually not so fettered in what they use that for when compared to the main CIL receipt. And the proposal is that that would remain, but they're interested in ideas about how to engage the community more and how that's spent. Currently, CIL has to be spent on infrastructure. Now, we've lost regulation 123 years, but infrastructure is a defined term. It's in the Planning Act 2008, and it's very broad, but it does have limitations. And the proposal is to increase flexibility, that once core infrastructure obligations are met, and it'll be key as to what are core infrastructure obligations, spending could include on improving services or reducing council tax. So you can see a spreading out of those revenues is proposed in this paper. And I think most planning practitioners would perhaps try and resist that. Affordable housing is currently outside of CIL, as we've discussed. And the proposal in the white paper is that it will have an in-kind provision, but also that to protect delivery of affordable housing, then receipts from that will be ring-fenced. And then lastly, for proposal 22, and actually this bleeds into proposal 23, which is more to do with funding the system generally. At the moment, a small proportion of CIL receipts are used to fund monitoring and administering the CIL system. And the proposal is that a small proportion, in inverted commas, we don't know how much, of income should be earmarked by local authorities to cover overall planning costs, and that includes relating to local plan prep, design codes and enforcement. So that is about creating a self-funding planning system that will take authorities past just using fees for that, but also using this infrastructure levy. So food for thought here. Is this the end of section 106? Well, no is the answer. I'd rather have the rug pulled out from under me here, because on the Addison Young webinar yesterday, I don't know if any of you listened or tuned into that, it was explained that actually this part of the paper was perhaps shorter than was ideal. Obviously, they were trying to fit within certain parameters to do with length, I imagine. But it wasn't the intention of the white paper to suggest that 106 would be somehow revoked, so taken off the statute book. The idea is that all of the finance will be stripped out of section 106, so all of the monetary payments, which I appreciate is largely what CIL was supposed to do but didn't do. And also affordable housing would come out. So 106 itself as a provision and as an ability to create agreements, etc., would remain. So that first bullet point, will it be missed? Well, it won't be, because it seems that it will stay, and so it can still deal with some of those issues, provided they don't leach into what's covered by infrastructure levy. I suppose anecdotally, if you really wanted to kill off section 106, and I've said it before, you might want to look at broadening what you can use a planning condition for. So that will mean much smaller agreements, albeit affordable housing wording is often in precedent form. But viability is still a cumbersome thing to have to grapple with. I just put a quote in the second bullet point there because it's one of my favourites, and this was from the new approach to developer contributions from a few years back, the SIL review panel, that had a lot of its recommendations ignored at the time, but perhaps they're now being looked at again. And they said the way SIL works is not liked by developers who seem to have discovered a nostalgic fondness for the Section 106 process. And that does make me wonder, will we miss the flexibility that 106 provides? Maybe you're all shouting at me, no, but that does make me wonder. So some more takeaway thoughts for you. Weren't the SIL review team proposals as good or better? Or alternatively, actually, isn't SIL slowly getting to where it needs to be, and the latest set of amendments seem to be well supported? It's not clear what's going to happen yet to current exemptions and reliefs that aren't mentioned, so we'll have to wait for that detail. There's, as I said, an issue to do with how is it set. If it's set nationally, how does that take account of differing site costs? Does it mean you end up with the lowest common denominator, which is one of the worries about SIL? And actually, in principle, should it be ring-fenced entirely for infrastructure? Again, I suspect that there'll be a dividing consultation responses down the middle as to who thinks it should just be spent on infrastructure because there's a lack of funding, or who thinks it should go into helping out with the planning system funding. So that was all I wanted to say about the white paper. There is a lot in there, and obviously we haven't touched upon local plans, but it's a big ideas paper, so I suppose it's for all of us to scratch our heads and feed into that consultation, which I'd encourage you to do so. Now, we've got a few minutes. I did have some questions that were sent before the webinar, so I'll try and deal with those first. And the first, I suspect, was a leading question, which is, do you think authorities have done enough to explain SIL to the public? And that's quite tricky to answer from mine and James' perspective, because frankly we're up to our eyeballs in SIL most of the time. To the general public, to people interacting with the development system, perhaps not. I don't think local authorities have proactively gone out messaging with SIL. Having said that, if you want to find that information, it's there, and pretty much every authority has multiple web pages on SIL. What I think is missing is the understanding as to what SIL is spent on, and you have to dig out monitoring reports to really find that information. And I know some developers do put out press releases or put up signs saying what they funded through their 106 and SIL packages, and it makes me wonder if that was something that needs to increase. We also had some questions to do with indexation. The first one is SIL always indexed from the date of adoption of SIL to the date the Commission is approved? Well, it's indexed from the latest adopted charging schedule, and the way indexation works is in the formula itself. So you'd have to go to, well, you do go to Schedule 1 of the SIL regs to look at that, and you look at the definitions of IP and IC, and IP is the figure for the year in which permission is granted, and IC is the latest charging schedule. A slight word of caution, obviously the index has changed, so if the index year falls in 2020 or later, then you'll be looking at the new RICS SIL index rather than the previous all-in tender price index. A question here about instalment schedules. Do authorities have to have them, or can they just insist on paying, charging still up front, sorry? And if they can still charge up front, how do you essentially retrospectively introduce phasing? Well, as James said, those policies are optional. Most authorities seem to have them, from what I can see, but they are optional. And the default is without a policy that is payable on commencement, either for the whole development or the first phase if it's phased. That's regulation 69B, if you want to go and look at that. In terms of introducing phasing, well, you can have phasing if you have a phased permission. I use that term because it's defined in the SIL regs, and that means a planning permission which expressly provides for development to be carried out in phases. And so there might be some work to do if you don't have that, probably using section 96A to try and introduce a condition into your permission that allows for submission of a phasing plan. So we're about on time now. I'm just very mindful that Have I Got Planning News for You starts shortly, and I don't really want to compete with 4 or 5 QCs. So we'll wrap it up there. We'll try and get back. We know most of you, so if there are questions on the chat, then we'll look to get back to you on those questions. Otherwise, thank you to James for helping out with this. Thank you to you for tuning in, or whatever the term is for webinars, and look out for future events. Thank you.